Some of you may be familiar with the name Jack Welch. In fact, I know of a few of you who actually worked under his leadership. From 1981 to 2003 or 2001, Welch was the CEO of GE, and he was a leader and pioneered many different things. And during his leadership, GE's revenue increased from $26.8 billion a year to $130 billion a year. So a significant increase under his leadership. But during his time, there was a shift that a lot of large publicly traded businesses began to do. And this was a philosophical shift on what they emphasized and what was important. During this time, the shift was to focus the attention of the company to maximize shareholder profits. Now, shareholders on some levels are owners of the company, and there's some philosophical debate on what that really means. But one of the practices that Welch implemented was every year he'd bring his main managers into his office or wherever it was, and the bottom 10% of managers, those who contributed the least to the profit of the company, were fired on the spot. The top 20% were given raises, were given stock options and praise, as that's what the company wanted. Now, an issue with the philosophy of maximizing shareholder profits is that it really only benefits a select group of people. The product rarely benefits or is enhanced. The customer is not emphasized. The employee isn't validated. Really, the only people it helps are the CEO, top executives, and corporate raiders, because even the average shareholder rarely, if any, sees much of an increase. But from this philosophy, this business philosophy, one of the things we learn is the fact that short-term gains bring long-term losses. Just because something works well in the meantime doesn't mean it's something we should continue to do over the long haul. It will bring sacrifices for us. And as followers of Jesus, James in James chapter 5 talks to us about how we are to treat others and what that is to look like. And he's specifically teaching or talking about those who are wealthy. But stay with me here. We're going to get to a point that I think applies to all of us. As he starts in verse 1, he says, "You rich, weep and groan with anguish because of all the terrible troubles ahead of you. Your wealth is rotting away. Your fine clothes are moth-eaten rags. Your gold and silver are corroded. The very wealth you are counting on will eat away your flesh like fire. This corroded treasure you have hoarded will testify against you on the day of judgment." Now, as we consider this concept of wealth that James is talking about, we recognize wealth is not sinful. In the Old Testament, it had several people that were wealthy. We think of Job and Abraham and Solomon. But Solomon also shows us how wealth can be dangerous, how it can be detrimental, how it can be a temptation for us. But one of the main temptations with wealth, I think, comes in the temptation of self-sufficiency. Well, I don't need God. I can do it on my own. We take God out of the equation. But wealth is arbitrary. It's relative. How much wealth is too much? You know, the reality is we need money. We need money to function in society and to actually have the things we need. But James is clear that every follower of Jesus has a responsibility. So we have a responsibility to make sure we think of the long-term ramifications, that we just don't focus on the short-term gains and neglect the long-term losses. Because the things we have will eventually fade. You know, the wealth won't last forever. And specifically, our clothes won't last forever. Our clothes will eventually deteriorate. We'll have to, maybe you can restore them on some level, but eventually the cloth, the material, will actually wear out and won't be any good anymore. But throughout James, he makes sure we know that everybody has worth and value in the kingdom of heaven. According to Jesus, everyone has value. So even if our things wear out, our value as someone who was created in the image of God will never fade, will never deteriorate, will never go away. So James is making sure we recognize the things of this world in comparison to the eternity that Jesus has called us. Because, you know, our wealth will go away. We have our clothes will deteriorate. And I do find it interesting that he talks about silver and gold. Silver and gold are precious metals, and one of the things is they don't rust. They are elements that just aren't impacted by rust, but they do corrode. In fact, some of you may have fine silverware at your house that you know that you have to polish every once in a while. And if you don't polish it, that tarnish gets pretty tough to get off. After decades of not taking care of that silver, the tarnish is stained, and it's almost impossible to actually get it off. Maybe it's not impossible. Maybe you're more familiar with fine silverware, but I'm not. So, we know it tarnishes. And gold doesn't tarnish in the same way as silver. One of the things I find interesting of gold, it is the element gold reacts with like almost nothing. And so it doesn't corrode like other materials or metal, but eventually it does. It gets filth on it, gets corrosion, something like tarnish, and we have to clean it and maintain it in order for it to maintain and keep its value. But James is not talking about our earthly things. He's using our earthly wealth and earthly possessions to talk about our spiritual health, because our spiritual health can corrode if we're not careful. And he uses our wealth as an evidence of when we put too much focus on our things, on our possessions, on our resources, then we are in danger of being spiritually corroded in our lives. Because no matter how much you get, no matter how much money you have in the bank, no matter how big your television is, there's always going to be a bigger one. Right? I remember when I got a 27-inch TV, and I was like, wow, that's a big TV. Now, it was a tube TV. Man, we have a 22-inch flat screen TV in our house, and like I look at it now, I'm like, who would use such a thing? Right? I mean, you can buy much bigger televisions for not very expensive, but that's the reality. There's always going to be something else that we can buy, something that is more enticing. But if we're not careful, these desires, these things, the wealth in our lives will deteriorate us, will be like fire that eats away at our spiritual life. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9 and 10, the Apostle Paul writes, "But people who long to be rich fall into temptation," and my tablet messed up. Oh, sorry about that. "Fall into temptation and are trapped by many foolish and harmful desires that plunge them into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And some people, craving money, have wandered from the true faith and pierced themselves with many sorrows." If we're not careful, money can get between us and God pretty easily. So we have to make sure we don't allow the things of this world to spiritually corrode us in a way that gets between us and God. And part of this can be seen in how we treat people and how we interact with people. And unfortunately, corporate America doesn't teach us very good lessons often about that. So I'm going to come back to Jack Welch and talk a little bit more about him. See, this shift of maximizing shareholder profit also came with another shift, or a result, a consequence of that shift. And it was to view employees as expendable resources. Now, from a transactional standpoint, an employee is an employee is a resource. They provide a service or a task or some type of responsibility, and they do that so the company makes money off of whatever they are doing. But that's a transaction. And so what would happen is companies like GE and other companies during this time would use layoffs as ways to balance the books or to beef up profits, to, again, maximize shareholder profits. That was what was happening. I'm sure many of you have experienced layoffs of those types of things. Well, it's that time of year again, we got layoffs. And this atmosphere created an atmosphere of competition where you didn't care if the company succeeded, you just cared if you kept your job, if you kept your bonus, if you kept your spot, wherever that was. So there are many companies that research has shown that have used this principle of using layoffs to maximize shareholder profits, and getting close to the time when those layoffs are typically decided and implemented, there is a drastic increase in internal complaints. That employees realize layoffs are coming. If I file this complaint, that might give me a leg up on other employees in the company. I may keep my bonus. I may keep my job. I may not have to worry about the layoffs. And so this atmosphere of competition rises time and time again. But see, the corporations had set this trend that the employee was an expendable resource, that regardless of the employee's tenure at the company, regardless of the history of the quality of work that they did, regardless of how close the employee was to retirement, they were an expendable resource. And I think we often treat people we encounter as an expendable resource. But James gives a practical example of those who are business owners, and he says that there are people who have worked in your fields whom you have cheated of their pay. Their cries have reached the ears of the Lord. You know, we've all been cheated before. And this isn't one of those things where somebody just did us wrong one time and it just frustrated us. This is perpetual wrongdoing of putting other people in bad positions for my personal gain. And those people who are cheated, who are oppressed, they long to be heard. When James is writing this, in his day, there was a much larger gap between the poor and the rich than there is today. Now, I'm not trying to say it's good, we don't need to fix anything, we still need progress. I'm not trying to speak against that. But the poor in James' day had even less going for them than the poor today. The average person in James' day had less going for them than the average person today. Because what would happen is employers would withhold wages from their worker. Well, the worker would get paid every day, and they'd get what's called a day's wage. And that wage would barely cover their living expenses, would barely put food on the table, would barely put a roof over their head. So they really had nothing in the bank. And so if an employer didn't pay them, they couldn't go on strike. They couldn't file a lawsuit. They didn't have the money to spend to do that, let alone money in the bank to help them weather that time of not having more work. And so they were powerless. So the rich would get richer and the poor would get poor. In fact, there are spots where God actually calls this murder because the worker didn't have money to buy food and as such would starve and go hungry and not be able to have the nutrition that he needs. But God has heard the cry of the oppressed. Now there's a responsibility I think that James is speaking to of those who have power, who have influence, have a responsibility to make sure that those things are used in ways that honor God. So this brings me to the question, do we need political reform? And everyone said yes, right? I have not met a single person in my life who said, man, I love the government and need to keep on doing what it's doing and not change a single thing. Now, there may be times where you have felt the government was doing good things, but in general, I've never met a person who was 100% satisfied with the government 100% of the time. That being said, James is not writing a political manifesto. He is writing to the people of God. He's writing to followers of Jesus saying, you guys need to live in the reality of the kingdom of heaven, not the kingdom of the world. And the kingdom of heaven says it's okay to exploit people. It's okay to treat others as expendable resources. It's okay to focus on shareholders and maximizing their profit, even though it's going to hurt other people. James is saying followers of Jesus need to be an example of the redemptive possibilities of Jesus in the world, not later, right now. That's what followers of Jesus need to do because the church is to live in the reality of the kingdom of heaven. So when we talk about short-term gains bring long-term losses, we cannot accept that. Now, there is a CEO that can stand in contrast to Jack Welch. His name is James Sinegal. He was one of the founders of Costco, and he was the CEO from 1983 to 2012. And he did, his philosophy in business was he treated his employees well, because he believed if he did that, the employees would be loyal and motivated to the company. So instead of an atmosphere and culture of competition, there was an atmosphere of collaboration. In fact, in 2009, when the recession was really underway in our country, he made the decision against his advisors not to do layoffs, not to decrease wages, but to actually provide a pay increase of 50 cents an hour. For the next 3 years, he increased wages by 50 cents an hour for a total of $1.50. And his thought was, this is not a time to add extra hardship to the employees. This is a time for us as a company to show we care about our employees. And so even though it didn't make business sense, it made relational sense. Now, to be fair, there are times where Costco has laid people off, but those times are the exception. See, instead of using layoffs as a way to balance the books and increase profits, Costco uses that as a last resort. But there are people in this world that don't. And so James gives a final warning in this section. He says, you have spent your years on earth in luxury, satisfying every desire. You have fattened yourself for the day of slaughter. You have condemned and killed innocent people who do not resist you. We all want to be comfortable, right? There's nothing wrong with being comfortable. You probably have a favorite chair or favorite spot on the couch at home, and it's just a place that's very comfortable for you. And there's nothing wrong with being comfortable, nothing wrong with having that enjoyment. But there's a big difference between enjoying God's blessings and living extravagantly. I said one of the issues is that wealth is relative of how much is too much. I can't stand here today and say, well, if you make this amount of money, everything above this needs to go somewhere else, go to some type of charitable organization. See, wealth is not an indication of spiritual health. There are a lot of wealthy people who want nothing to do with Jesus. So we have to recognize that wealth is not one of those things where, well, if we're faithful to Jesus, we're going to have all these earthly resources. That's not what Jesus has called us to do. Now, at the same time, there's nothing holy about being poor. Jesus doesn't say that we just need to live destitute lives and that's it and nothing else. We have pleasures in this world that Jesus allows us to enjoy. He gave us desires. But if we fill them without Jesus, they become sinful. But just withholding those pleasures isn't exactly what Jesus calls us to do. But see, Jesus is concerned with how we live our lives. He's concerned with how we make our money. He's concerned with how we earn our money, how we spend it, and all of that we do with our money. So if you took an audit of your finances, your personal finances, I'm not nosy, but you might be interested to know what that would actually entail. You know, money can evaporate from our bank accounts pretty quickly without us really thinking about it. But does your money actually go in places that you want it to go? Does it go to support the local church? Does it go to help the oppressed? Does it go to help your neighbor? Does it go to help those who can't help themselves? Or does it go just for me? For my comfort, for my security, for my safety? How can I be more secure and safe in my world? See, money is necessary in our world, but it's a mean and nasty master. Money will grab you by the neck and not let go. That's why we have to guard against the temptation to seek short-term gains that have long-term losses. See, the more we indulge in things like money and resources and the things of this world, the more we indulge in sin, the more we prepare ourselves for the slaughter of judgment. And maybe that's imagery we're uncomfortable with, but maybe that's the point, that we should be convicted. We should feel challenged. Because the reality is prosperity is attractive. When someone has money, when someone has fun gadgets, fun toys, all of these opportunities before them, when they can go on these extravagant vacations and have nice and fancy cars, that's attractive. We desire that. We desire to want to be that person's friend or be close to them, not just so we can get something from them, but because they're attractive. But this desire for worldly things is dangerous because of the nature that it can spiritually corrode us, which will negatively prepare us for Judgment Day. As James talked about earlier, it will testify against you on the day of judgment. But again, money is not necessarily bad, but also the reason one is oppressed is of no consequence. If I am to help someone, I don't evaluate, well, why are you oppressed? Did you shoot yourself in the foot? Are you in that situation because you made poor decisions? Well, shame on you. Go away, live long and prosper, do better next time. That's the mentality we tend to have, as opposed to how can we build the kingdom of heaven? How can we help people who can't help themselves? So James is teaching the moral implications of what it means to follow Jesus. And he contrasts following Jesus with sinful humanity. The rich oppress the poor. That's happened throughout all of history. That's not a new thing. It's not a new temptation. It's a major problem in our world, but it's not new. And the church is called to resist the temptation to enter that mentality. But I think it's important we do recognize that just because you aren't wealthy, whatever that may look like, doesn't mean James is giving you an excuse. He says we all have a responsibility. Now, as I compared Jack Welch and James Sinegal and GE and Costco, all that might be good and everything, but we have to look at the numbers and the profits of what actually happened. If you would compare them, you would find that GE's revenue did dramatically increase during Welch's tenure. But we also would find that the market just naturally, drastically increased during his tenure. So to say that GE's success was just because of Welch's decisions would disregard what the market was actually doing at the time. But also, if you would have invested in both companies in 1986, that's when Costco went public. So from 1986 to 2013, if you would have invested in the companies, GE would have made you 600% return on investment. Now, I don't know in that time frame what a good return on investment would actually be, but if you would invest in Costco during that time, you would have received a 1,200% return on your investment. So the company that valued the employees, that did not put emphasis on shareholder profits, actually made their shareholders more money. Now, I do want to be fair. GE did peak during that time frame at an increased profit of 1,600% on the return on investment. So if you would have sold at the right time, you could have made more money on GE than on Costco. But we see the trajectory of the company show that over the long term, Costco, the company that cares for its people, is the one that makes more money. At this point, you may be saying, great, so what? What I fear has happened too often is that followers of Jesus get so concerned with the short term that we are making long-term sacrifices. That we're so concerned with what's in front of us that we miss the long game that Jesus has called us to live in. Because what we are called to do as followers of Jesus is to usher in and build the kingdom of heaven. We're called to live in that reality now, invite others to come live in it as well. But every 4 years, we get this wonderful reminder that the world is just a terrible place, right? We get this reminder that there are competing kingdoms in our world. So in 2 days, our presidential election will happen. And the next president of the United States, whether it continues to be Donald Trump or Joe Biden, will be decided. Probably won't be decided on Tuesday if we're being realistic. But will be decided sometime in the near future. We're going to vote on Tuesday. But I was thinking about this and trying to gain some perspective. The United States of America has about 4% of the world's population. It's about 4.2, somewhere in there, so 4%. And if 1% of the population in our country votes for whichever candidate, that candidate will probably win. That would be about 75 million people. Hillary Clinton got 65 million votes 4 years ago. So if 1% of the population of our country votes for one of the candidates, they will likely be the next president of the United States. So as I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about all the fear, all the anxiety, all of the emphasis going into the election. And there are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle that are saying, well, if this happens or this happens, the world's going to end, or all this terrible calamity is going to happen. But here's the truth that I think we have to recognize, that if 1% of the world's population can stop God and can prevent him from fulfilling his purposes, then we might as well not serve that God. See, if the world can't function, or if the world can stop God in any way, shape, or form, then we've got a major problem with our faith. But what I need to remind you today is I fear that there are a lot of non-Christians who are watching Christians right now. There are a lot of people who don't know Jesus, who are watching people who claim to know Jesus and seeing how they are so panicked right now. How they are fighting tooth and nail and bitter and mean and not very Jesus-like in their conversations. And they're saying, you're not any different than I am. You're just advocating a political ideology. You're not worried about this Jesus guy. You're worried about yourself is all you're worried about. We have to ask ourselves the question, is God in control or is He not? Now, this does not mean that we're indifferent to what's happening in the world. This doesn't mean, I'm not telling you today, stop voting. That is not my purpose or point any way, shape, or form. Because to be honest, I have a political preference. I do. I'm human. Ask Hannah. But our first priority is to build and usher in the kingdom of heaven, not fight for the kingdom of this world. We have to change that mentality. Now, I have a person I want to get elected, but whoever does get elected is not going to save the world. The right laws being passed are not going to get people into the kingdom of heaven. Only Jesus gets them into the kingdom of heaven, and it's my responsibility to help people realize that. You know, for the last 2,000 years, the kingdom of heaven has been built and ushered in by followers of Jesus. And again, trying to gain some perspective here, if one elected official in a country that has 4% of the world's population can stop the kingdom of heaven, then I think we got a problem with the church. I think we have a faith in Jesus problem. I don't think we have a political problem. We look at our country. I feel so grateful and blessed to be living in the United States of America. There are so many freedoms afforded to us, so many privileges, so many benefits. I feel so blessed in a way that almost makes me feel ashamed of people in countries that don't have the same types of freedoms that we do. Through the history of our country, it has been founded on Judeo-Christian principles. You know, the Jewish and Christian worldview and concept of God and justice and all those types of things. That has been the worldview of how our country understands law and order, which has made it pretty easy for Christians. Which brings me to the conclusion. I think we have been blinded by the wealth that we have amassed by living in such a cushy country. We're blinded by all that wealth that we have, so we have become spiritually corroded. You may not have a bunch of money in the bank account. Man, you got a lot of freedoms that money can't buy. You have a lot of things in your life that, you know what? A lot of people in the world don't experience those things. And what's happening is I feel, whether it's real or imaginary, there's a lot of people who follow Jesus who feel as though those privileges are getting squished. Those privileges are trying to be taken away in different areas, and we're panicking. What's going to happen if my charitable tax receipts are no longer tax deductible? Oh no! How is Jesus going to survive? How are we going to pay for things? Well, you know, Jesus is going to figure it out, because there are plenty of countries where charitable contributions aren't tax deductible. There are plenty of countries where people are fearing for their lives. We sang this song earlier today, The Lion and the Lamb, and I have just really been thinking about that song recently, the last few days, just really been on my mind. You know, we talk about Jesus is the Lamb. And the scriptures tell us in John, He's the Lamb of God that comes to take away the sins of the world. He is the sacrificial Lamb that died for our sins. He is the servant who gave of Himself to us, even though we rejected Him, so that we might be saved. But He's going to come back as the lion. And when He comes back as the lion, He's going to get down to business. He's going to make things right. Heads are going to roll. He's going to come with power and might, and nothing is going to stand against him. Here's what I think is happening. I think there are followers of Jesus who said, man, it's been a long time. Jesus needs to start coming back soon. Maybe I need to start being the lion for him. Maybe I need to start busting some heads so the kingdom of heaven can be built. But what I believe Jesus is calling us to be, he is not calling us to be the lion, he is calling us to be the lamb. He is calling us to lay our lives down for this world so that people will come to know him. You're not going to beat people into submission to know Jesus. You're going to serve people into submission. You're going to sacrifice people into submission. You're going to love people into submission because we long for them to know Jesus. The people that we encounter who don't know Jesus are fattening themselves up for the day of slaughter. They are preparing themselves negatively for the day of judgment. And Jesus says, be the lamb for them. Be the lamb for that one person. There are many people you will encounter or interact with or maybe just witness and see who are panicked right now. What would happen if we self-sacrificed ourselves for the world in a way that says, I know the answer. And it's not red or blue. It's not Republican or Democrat or independent or green or libertarian. It's in the Lamb. That is the answer. We wait for the lion. We long for the lion. We want to be restored to the lion. But right now, Jesus says, be the lamb. Lay your lives down for this world so they might come to know me. So we're going to sing The Lion and the Lamb, if you didn't gather that. I pray that this is the testimony of the church. Because we have the rhetorical question in the song, who can stop the Lord? I believe the answer is no one and nothing. And if that's true, I don't need to panic. I don't need to fear. I just need to focus on being the lamb. If somebody can stop the Lord, then I need to be the lion. I need to take care of myself. I need to live selfishly. But because the lamb cannot be stopped and the lion's coming, I wait for him. And I build his kingdom, usher in his kingdom, and sacrifice for others.